All right, thanks so much for having me here today. I will start, as always, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands that we're on. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the mighty Kulin Nation, pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations comrades who may be at the conference today. Um, and because, hang on a second. And because I'm from the Victorian Trades Hall Council, I am also going to do, I think, our solidarity statement. So this is an expression of the values that we bring to everything we do as trade unionists. We are union. We stand united as part of a great movement of workers. Our diversity is our strength. Our solidarity is our power. We respect and take care of each other. Prejudice and discrimination, including misogyny, racism and homophobia, and all other hatreds have no place in our movement. We rise together. Today and every day, we commit ourselves to achieving justice, fairness, equality, and dignity for all workers. Solidarity forever, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about making change, and I have subtitled this, No One is Coming to Save Us, because I am very firmly of the view that it is the trade union movement that is the only progressive organisations that are actually capable of delivering real and lasting change. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk a little bit about my understanding of power. But before I do, just by way of context, this is me. I'm clearly a trade unionist. I'm a feminist. I am a campaigner, as has been described, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the campaigns that I've been involved in. And I am also very late in life, a social media influencer. And if you don't currently follow me on either TikTok or Instagram, shame on you is what I would say. I have become an influencer in the space, particularly of politics and feminism, but particularly in the space of trade unionism. And so, yeah, that's a fun and exciting thing that's happened to me around my late 50s, early 60s. As was talked about, I started my life with apologies as a lawyer, but then I saw the light and I came to work in the trade union movement, and I started at the Australian Services Union. So the ASU, in that space, I worked with members in the social and community services area. That's 84% women. And they, at the time that I started working there in 2004, a full-time worker with a degree qualification was earning roughly $20,000 less than the average Australian wage. And we believed that that was because it's a care sector, and we have historically undervalued care work because it's largely seen as women's work, and the workers in that sector were people who were very committed to the work that they were doing and did it for the love of it, but had never really gotten to the point where they were industrially saying, we do it for love and money. So we started a campaign which was about changing their award so that their wages would rise. And we ran that campaign through the Fair Work Commission as a case for equal pay, arguing that the undervaluation was related to the fact that it was predominantly women in the sector. But in order to achieve true wage justice, we also had to run an on-the-ground campaign because, of course, if you raise wages in a sector by 50% and it's a government-funded sector and the government doesn't increase the funding, that means 50% of workers are going to lose their jobs. So we had to run an on-the-ground campaign as well to get government to come to the table with more money. And at the end of that campaign, which lasted a total of 5 years, the workers' wages were increased by between 23 and 45% by the Fair Work Commission. And at the same time, governments put in an additional $5 billion into the sector to pay their wages, which was a fantastic outcome. And then, as was described there, I also worked then, once I'd finished at the ASU, I came across to VTHC and I coordinated large-scale political campaigns. So we had a new Liberal government in Victoria when I came here in 2013. That government had annoyed a number of unions, including the Victorian ANMF. They'd promised 800 beds and in fact had cut beds from the system. And so unions had resolved to run a marginal seats campaign, a political campaign to unseat the Liberal government. And so that campaign was called We Are Union, and I came into the VTHC to coordinate that campaign, rolled out on the ground in a number of marginal seats. And as a result of that campaign, we did change the government. We did something that had not been done in over 100 years. we had a one-term government and we changed over to a Labor government that promptly delivered nurse-patient ratios in legislative form for the ANMF in Victoria. And then I got to, it was my great privilege to coordinate the Yes campaign for marriage equality in Victoria as part of the postal survey campaign. That was a campaign that involved over 10,000 people out on the ground, and it's many of them who had never taken any form of political action before. And as a result of that campaign, we're very proud that in Victoria we had the highest yes vote of any state. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, through all of that campaigning, some of the lessons that I've learned and how I understand power. And as I said, why it is that I believe that the trade union movement is best placed to make real lasting change. So this is an obvious statement, but to make change requires that you have power. But the way I understand power is that there are two models, right? There's the appeal to power model, and then there's what I call the trade union model, which is the exercise power model. Now, the appeal to power model is the way that most progressive organisations, in my experience, operate. And that means they look at who has power and then they say, well, what do they care about? And then they go to those in power and they say, you should do the right thing here. You should make change because it's the right thing to do. And that means, for instance, in the feminist space, a lot of the feminist discourse now is about talking about the business case for diversity and inclusion, or appealing to those in power saying you should be a champion of change, or imagine that if something that happened to your daughter. And so what we do is we frame the arguments about progressive change in the language that appeals to those in power. And it's good in terms of a model for change because it means that you don't need a lot of resources, and you can, go out and campaign pretty quickly. The downside is that change happens in the way and at the pace that those in power are comfortable with. And it's not going to be surprising to anyone when I say that actually those in power are relatively uncomfortable with change because they get to a position of power because of the systems as they are. And so when you do that kind of change, you don't have any control over what the outcome is. Whereas the model of change that we in the union movement use is what I call the exercise power model of change. And that is, we go to the decision maker and we say, you need to make the change that we want to see, and you should be afraid of us because there are consequences if you don't do this. And so we force change to happen. Now, for that to happen, and the reason we can do that successfully in the trade union movement is because it needs one or two things, right? You either have to have money or you have to have people. Now, we as in the trade union movement, there's money in unions, but obviously that money is dedicated largely to delivering the services that people join a trade union for, right? The bargaining and the industrial issues and the occupational health and safety issues and having experts and all of that, right? But the other thing that we have that most other progressive movements don't have is we have people. And we have people who have actually chosen to be members. They pay money to be members because they understand that we get better outcomes when we work together. And so the important thing about what we do as a movement is we build collective. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about what I understand building collective to be, and then I'm going to let you get on with the other important things that you are doing today. And I'm not going to talk about getting people to join the union because you're all delegates, you're all activists, you all know how to have that conversation. I'm going to talk about how we build collectivism, a couple of the things that I've learned about doing that in large-scale campaigning. So the first thing I'm going to say is what I've learned is activists go where the action is. We have a tendency sometimes to think everything's got to be perfect. We need all our ducks in a row before we go out and do something. But actually, what I've learned is sometimes you have to build the plane and fly it at the same time. Sometimes you've just got to go out and do stuff, and that is how you're going to bring people into your campaign rather than your campaign being absolutely perfect before you start. The other thing I've learned, one of the other things I've learned, is that your campaign should do some fun stuff. And just to give context for this particular action, in Victoria, we had a Liberal opposition leader who went and had lunch in the Lobster Cave with what newspapers often euphemistically call a colourful local identity. And that became known as the lobster with a mobster scandal. And so we spent $400 on an inflatable lobster, and then we got a whole lot of lobster suits, and we followed that opposition leader around wherever he went. And it got to the point where we had media and journos ringing us, telling us where the opposition leader was going to be, because it's not surprising they didn't tell us that, because they wanted the colour and movement of our lovely big inflatable lobster and all of our people holding those signs. And you can't see those signs, but they were developed by our activists and our crew here, and they say things like, "This all looks a bit fishy," and other terrible puns, which were a lot of fun, right? So one of the other things I've learned is that as you do campaigning, you want to do stuff that's a heap ton of fun. The other thing I've learned about campaigning is that you have to think about it as a marathon. So a lot of campaigns that we do, they take longer than we want them to. Of course, we all want the change we want to see immediately, but in the campaigning, in particularly the political and the social justice space in particular, these things take time. So if you think about the campaigns that I talked about at the start, the kind of primary campaign, the social and community services workers campaign, that took 5 years from the start, when those members, we went out and talked to them about the idea that they were entitled to better wages and conditions. And yes, of course, they did what they did because they loved it and they cared very much about their clients. But also, the sector was not going to survive if the current generation of workers retired and if wages weren't improving, because we were in a situation where new workers coming into the sector were leaving within 12 months to go and work in other places because they couldn't consider being able to afford a house or start a family. So we went out, it took 5 years to get those workers to the point where they were prepared to rally and walk off the job to deliver better services to their clients, but also better wages for themselves. And then that second campaign I talked about, so the We Are Union political campaign, that was 12 months active out on the ground, doing street stalls, train stations, door knocks. So we got active very early and we started early and we were consistent. We were out every weekend for 12 months before the election talking to people, so that by the time the election was called, everybody knew what our issues were, and everyone in those, particularly in those marginal seats, knew who we were. And then you think about marriage equality. John Howard changed that law in 2004, and it took till 2017 for that law to be changed. So campaigning is a marathon, and that can be tiring, and it can be difficult, and it can be challenging. And so the most important lesson that I have learnt along the way is that actually campaigning in collective is the only way to deliver the kind of change that we want to see, because it is in the collective that we get our strength and resilience, right? When one of us feels tired, we know that there are a lot of other people around us who also are involved in that campaign, so that we can rest and other people can stand up. And so I firmly believe that the trade union movement is the only movement that's capable of delivering real and lasting change. And so to go right back to my very first slide, or one of the early slides, that is why I believe that no one else is coming to save us. If there are changes that we want to see in the world, it is incumbent on us as a movement to help drive and lead those changes, because we are the only ones capable of doing that. And I'm going to stop sharing, I think now. There we go. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think I might have managed to talk about campaigning in the 15 minutes that I had, which means that I haven't interrupted the flow of your conference. There you go.
Thank you, Wil.
I can hand back to... There you go.
Thank you, Wil, for that. That was short but invigorating. I've had the pleasure of working with the VHTC on campaigning when I worked with the ACTU, and a lot of what you've said resonates with me in terms of building the collective. The take-home messages I've got from you is that perfect is the enemy of good enough, that you've just got to get out and start the campaign and play it on the hoof and learn along the way. That it's about, in that sense, momentum always. I really like what you said about fun and that's about resilience and stamina. In Queensland, for example, back in 2002, which was the last big public sector campaign we ran up to today, we did employ and had fun, and in terms of it allowed us to share in that humour. It allowed us to re-energise. It allowed us to celebrate our hopefulness. And for example, what we called the Chunder Bucket Express, which was a remark made by the then health minister about all nurses do is carry bedpans. Well, we didn't. We embraced that, and we ran a bus carrying nurses with a bedpan all the way from North Queensland all the way down to Brisbane. And it resonated with messaging that all nurses and indeed midwives could identify with. I think the other thing about fun, I think, is that humour is something you can use in a satirical way. You can really cut through with humour in terms of ridiculing your opponents, as you did, for example, with the lobster, metaphor down there. So it's about resilience, it's about stamina building. And I think the last thing you said that you reminded me is that in the collectivism, we're not alone, that there will be at times in a long campaign, and campaigns are a marathon, where you will have to let go, you'll have to take a rest, someone else is going to take up the front for you. But importantly, that you are never alone in that. So I think there are definitely all messages that we can identify with, and it's always great to be reminded of them and share memories. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me today. And one thing I'll just say, I learned that lesson about resilience really the night before they announced the result of the Marriage Equality Postal Survey. That was the moment for me. I was so frightened, but when I got up the next morning and I came into work and I was surrounded by all these amazing people, what I realised is, of course, it would feel bad to have that loss, but any loss would be the start of the next thing that we did. So it was the comradeship and the friendship that I had in that really made that for me. So that's the last thing I'll say. And I will happily leave you. Thank you so much for having me. And I will happily leave. Oh, and if you're not following me on social media, you should do. It's just me under my name. There you go. That's all I've got. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Wil. Cheers, comrade.